Is the power of intention a real thing? How about telepathy and precognition? Well, in this show, Dr. Helané Wahbeh and I explore those topics and the research that supports them indeed being real. Not only that, we looked at them through the lens of how those abilities can be used to serve others in support of their health and well-being. Let's dive into this fascinating episode now. Hello, Helene. Huge welcome back to the show.
Thank you so much, Lian. It's a pleasure to be here with you today.
Oh, it feels like another magical topic. We couldn't remember when we last spoke. We think it was maybe 2 or 3 years ago, and we spoke then about channeling. And I think it was the first time we'd done an episode on that topic. And I think probably, although we're all often talking in the realms of things about telepathy, I think this is probably the first show we've sort of dedicated specifically to that topic. So I'm really excited. So
Yes.
let's start there. Let's start there. What is telepathy? When you're talking about telepathy, I'd love to know your definition of that.
Yeah. So, people may or may not have heard that term. And yet I bet that a majority of the people listening to this call have had some type of telepathic experience. So, imagine yourself, you're just relaxing, watching TV or reading a book, and then all of a sudden you get an impression in your mind that appears to be coming from someone else, or maybe even an animal, or somewhere else that isn't quite your own. And so that is a telepathic experience. So the word telepathy was actually coined in 1882 by Frederick W.H. Myers, who is one of the founders of the Society of Psychical Research. And he defined it as the communication of impressions of any kind from one mind to another that's independent of recognized channels of sense. So, I've had this happen to me before. I was sitting there washing the dishes and I got such a strong image of my mom. And I was like, okay, what's going on? So I called her and found out that she had had a very intense experience when I was sitting there doing the dishes. So that's just another example of how it kind of can show up in our lives. And at the Institute of Noetic Sciences, we have this premise that we are all interconnected. And so when you hold that understanding, it makes sense that we could get these mental impressions from other people. But the dominant paradigm in science right now doesn't really hold that in the same way. They don't really see how we could actually be connected in that way. So there's more research that's being done to actually evaluate it, see if it's real, see how common it is, see how it could potentially work. What are the different mechanisms that I could actually get this mental impression from someone else from, say halfway across the country. Another really fun way that it shows up very, very frequently is with the telephone. And it used to be that, we didn't have these smartphones that would show, who was calling. We didn't have caller ID, if you will. And you'd hear the phone ring, and many people would have the experience of knowing who was calling them. Even if it was someone they hadn't talked to for years, the phone would be ringing and they would just get this impression of, oh, this is Aunt Sally who I haven't talked to in 5 years. And sometimes they'd even have that impression before the phone started ringing. So that's called telephone telepathy. Have you ever experienced that where the phone was
Yes.
ringing and you're like, oh, I know who that is?
Yes, and I notice, as you say, we're kind of now in a world where we can be contacted in all kinds of ways with our phones. And I notice often for me, it will come in the form of a text message moments after. It might be I've been thinking about some. I had some examples this week that was so So precise, as in something I'd been thinking about someone, they then message me about the thing. But often I notice it comes like that recently, where it's I'll be thinking about someone and then they'll message me, and again, often message me with something like that's quite precise, that, there isn't an obvious way I would know that, unless, as you suggest, there is a kind of deeper interconnection. And what I love about the work you do is it's bringing together these kind of what had been quite sort of disconnected fields of this realm of the unknown, psi, the supernatural, all the different ways we might relate to it, and then science, and actually saying, no, they can belong together. So I know you've been looking specifically at this notion of telephone telepathy. So I'd love to know what you've discovered through that.
Yes. So, we've seen all this research showing how common it is. And just to touch on that again, there have been surveys that have been done in Europe and the UK, in the US, that show that majority of people have actually had this telepathic experience of mentally being in touch with someone far away. So, sometimes there's taboos about talking about this, and yet when you actually do the research, you realize this is incredibly common and people have this experience all the time, which is really quite fascinating. So Rupert Sheldrake is kind of a famous scientist. So he's done a number of research studies on telephone telepathy and found some remarkable positive results demonstrating that yes, people can tell who is calling them significantly above chance. So we wanted to replicate the work that he did and to take it one step further. So we fortunately received funding from the Bial Foundation in Portugal to do this really big study. So we were very curious about a few things. One is, could we replicate this finding that yes, people can accurately know who's calling them above chance? And then also, what are the characteristics of the relationships between these people that make it stronger? Because I know that I have this with my mother a lot more than, some random person who I just met. So does a genetic relationship, do family members, can they do this better than others? Are people who are emotionally close, are they better at this than others? Does it matter how often you're talking to that person? So communication frequency. And then does physical distance matter? So we hypothesized, we guessed ahead of time that yes, people would have above chance accuracy on this telephone telepathy task, that family members would be better than non-family members, that people who were emotionally close would be better, that people who communicated frequently would be better, but that physical distance would not matter. So if I was 50 miles away versus 1,000 miles away, it wouldn't matter. The accuracy would be the same. So we designed this interesting experiment where we enrolled groups of 3 people, and they could be family members or friends. So let's say, Lian, you signed up with a relative and a friend. You would go onto our website, you'd fill out this form that said how you were related, how close you were, how far away you lived from each other. And then once you were enrolled, you would receive telephone calls. And when you looked on your phone, it would just say Ion's telephone telepathy, okay? And then there would be a computer voice that would say, welcome, to the Ion's telephone telepathy. Who do you think you will be connected to? Person A, person B, or no one? And then you would make your choice.
Oh, so there was a kind of control where there was also a call that actually wasn't a real call from either of the other 2 people.
Exactly. So the computer would randomly call at everybody at a random time during the day, so you wouldn't know that the call was coming. And then you would have to say, okay, who do I think I'm going to be connected to? And you'd make your choice. then after all three people made their choice, the computer would randomly connect two people. Okay, so that was one
So can I
path.
check? So the no one was proactively calling someone else in that instance. It would be more that the computer would determine these two people are going to speak.
Exactly.
Hmm.
And so that was one path that this experiment took. And we called that the precognitive path because, like you're alluding to, no one knew in that moment who they were going to be connected to. They would only find out in the future who they were going to be connected to. So precognition means knowing the future. So that's one path. The second path was you would get a phone call from Ion's telephone telepathy, and it would say, "Hi, Lian. In a moment, you're going to be connected to your relative. Please send your positive intention towards them." So think about them. Think about them. You're about to be connected with them. The computer would also call that other person and say, "Hi, you're going to be connected to someone. Is it going to be person A, person B, or no one?" So for them, it was exactly the same as the other path. But the difference was that now you knew who you were going to be connected to and you were sending your positive intention to them. So what was so fascinating about this study is that,
Can I check that that second version is more similar to how things happen in real life, in that someone knows they're going to speak but to the other person, but the person receiving it doesn't yet. So it's quite similar to how things are in everyday life.
yes.
Mm.
And so what was fascinating is that we found that that first version where nobody knew and it was from the future did not have above chance results. But the telepathy version where that person was directing their positive intention did. It was significantly above chance. People were able to guess who was calling them. So
Wow.
this
And with that
support,
one, it could still be a choice between their relative or the other, like it is of two people. So they had above average chance of guessing whether it was the right one out of the two possibilities. Is that right?
they had three choices. They said, "Am I going to be
Oh yes,
connected to
computer.
person A, person B, or no
Mm,
one?" So
yes.
to them, the two paths were exactly the same. And so they were just, in the trial, who am I going to be connected with? So the main difference was this telepathy. So there was a 33% chance that they would guess it correctly. And it was like 50% accuracy on the telepathic
Wow. Yes.
trial.
Mm,
So,
goodness.
critics might say, "Oh, well, people could cheat because they were in the same room." And so, because if you, Leanne, got the call to focus on your relative and your relative was right there in the room, you could say to them, "Oh, here's the call. I'm going to focus on you. They're going to call you right now and you need to guess and it's me," right? So that
Mm.
is a potential possibility that we couldn't figure out how to prevent. But we did an analysis looking at distance, physical distance, because everybody said where they lived in relation to each other. And we looked to see if people who lived in the same house were more accurate on those trials, and they weren't.
Mm.
So it didn't
Wow.
matter how far away people lived from each other, the telepathic trials were more accurate. So
Mm.
that was really exciting to us, and it supports this whole idea that our intention matters and that it actually
Mm.
can influence the physical world. And there's a huge wealth of research supporting that notion in so many different ways, from our intention affecting physical bodies, affecting cells in petri dishes, plants, animals. There have been studies in labs where pairs of people come in and one person's sending intention and the other person's physiology is changing, whether it's brain waves or heart waves or their skin conductance, the goosebumps or different changes in their skin. And I could, keep talking to you for hours about the different types of studies that people have done looking at how intention can affect the physical world. So telephone telepathy is just kind of a fun, practical example that people experience every day. And this helped us learn a little bit about perhaps how it might work, that it's through this intention rather than knowing the future. And I didn't really highlight this, but that first path, some people feel that, if you get, you can actually get senses or information from the future. So that precognitive path, eventually people know who they're going to be connected to. So if they're more accurate, maybe it's because they're tapping into their future when they know who they were connected to. Does that make sense?
Yes, it really does, because as you say, there's been studies more specifically focusing on precognition that also shows, that is a thing too. And yet it
Right.
seems from the study you've done, of the two, certainly in that study, it was the telepathy in terms of picking up someone else's intention that was seemed at least more powerful, let's say.
Yes, that's exactly right. And it continues to support all the other research that's been done about this idea that intention matters. And we're doing a lot of work on this around healing, which I think is so powerful and very practical and supportive to our world about how using focused positive intention can actually support people's health and support their healing. And so there's been numerous studies looking at that as well.
Yes, this is where it feels especially interesting and helpful for the listeners of this show. As I was sharing with you, um, a large part of our audience are change workers, healers of some kind. They may be working in a kind of very obvious direct healing capacity. I mentioned to you earlier that I work as a shamanic healer as one of my many roles. Or they might be working as, say, for example, a coach or a therapist. So it's still ultimately a form of healing, but they may not call themselves a healer or see themselves as a healer. And certainly in my own experience, intention is all important. When I'm when I'm about to do a healing with someone, much of the work beforehand is that clarity. Like, what is the intention? Let's get clear on that. Let's like really bring our focus to that. I describe it sometimes like a kind of tip of an arrow that everything else pulls behind. And so I'm especially interested in this because, I see that it has power, but I'd love to know what you're discovering in the studies you're doing. Like what's happening there? Why does it have power? How can we know it has power?
Yes, yes. Maybe we can talk a little bit about what intention is, because sometimes people don't quite know or understand that. And, there's something called attention, which is where we focus our attention to, right? But that's different than intention. So, intention you can think of as our focused will, like you said, that tip of the arrow, plus our attention. So, we're bringing our focused will to manifest something essentially in the physical world. And it's different than a goal, because a goal is an outcome that we can work towards. With intentions, it's like you're declaring, you're setting your focused will on a specific quality of being, a specific situation to unfold, a specific outcome, but then you let it go because you aren't necessarily taking the steps that need to happen for it to manifest. It's like using your focused will to plant a seed and then just trusting that it will unfold. So, intention has been studied in many, many different ways, and I touched on them, but I can share a little bit more about it. So there's a large group of studies called the distant mental intention of living systems. And this is a laboratory protocol where pairs of people would come into the lab and they would go into completely separate rooms. They would be hooked up to physiological measurement devices, whether it's brain waves or heart waves or electrodes on the skin. And then one person, who they called the sender, every time the image of their loved one would show up on the screen in the other room, they would focus their positive intention towards that person. And then when their picture went away, they would stop. And so at the end of that experiment, when they'd look at the changes in the receiver's physiology, it matched to when the picture was on the screen, and it would go away when the picture wasn't on the screen. So this
So when you
was
say physiology, you mean like specific, it could be their breathing or their temperature, like something in their state that you can measure.
yes. So let's look at heart rate. So their heart rate would change when the person was looking at their picture versus not. And they're at completely separate parts of the building.
My
So
goodness.
there's no way that the receiver knew when their partner was, directing intention towards them. And these studies have been done in many, many different labs around the world, and it's been replicated numerous times. We're actually doing a study right now on the gut. So the gut has incredible nervous system, and we're going to have pairs of people come into the lab. They're going to be completely isolated, and one person is actually going to eat a meal, and we're going to see if the other person's digestive system responds to their partner eating a meal in a completely different part of the body. So that's
Oh my
a
goodness.
little,
And so when the person who's eating the meal, are they somehow, is there like an intention to focus on the other person in that? Like,
yes, they
yeah,
know
so,
that.
mm,
Yes, they know that that's the goal, okay,
mm,
my eating may influence the other person. Anyway, that's a little bit of an aside. But yes, that group of studies has really, I think, powerful evidence demonstrating
mm.
intention. There's also another group of studies done by Rupert Sheldrake again about staring. So I don't know if you've had this experience, you're in a coffee shop, you're just hanging out, reading your book or whatever, then all of a sudden you just turn around and you're like, oh, that person is staring at me. And
Mm.
it's this kind of felt sense that when someone is looking at you. So that happens in our daily lives all the time. But
Mm.
this has been formally evaluated in the laboratory, and people can tell when someone is directing their visual intention towards them also. The last group of experiments I'll share with you about is with something called a random number generator. So these are probabilistic devices that basically spit out zeros and ones, just to kind of simplify it, a data stream of zeros and ones. So at the end of the day, you should have an equal number of zeros and an equal number of ones. It's just completely random. So there have been numerous experiments done where people come to the lab and they're asked to direct their intention to this device to either create more ones or more zeros. And they find that they can do that. That the studies show that yes, mentally intending for the data to change changes the data, even though there's no kind of rational reason why that is so. So moving it back to this healing piece, people
Can
have,
I ask a quick question actually
yes,
before it's related to where you're about to go? With these studies, and it may be they vary, are they people who are just, you know, any member of the public, or are they people who, for whatever reason, are, it may be that the role they're in, kind of, they have a more openness, let's say, more sensitivity, more ability to hold an intention, or is it a bit of both?
So there have been numerous studies done with what we've called general public or unselected people. Just anybody who wants to do it comes in and does it.
Mm-hmm.
And for the most part, we do see sometimes the results are mixed, but there are still positive findings, but they're usually smaller with people who are, if you just took 100 random people, you may see an effect, but it may be a little bit smaller. But if you took people who were meditators,
Mm-hmm.
who believed that they could do it, who had either meditation or some other focused attention training, who are also extroverts, and those are kind of the strongest predictors of people doing really well on these type of tasks and having stronger intention effects.
Really fascinating. And I guess there's a question there of how much it's um, a natural, you could say, like an aspect of their design, as in, some people have blue eyes, some people have more sort of sensitivity to these things. But there's also my own experience and that of working with other people. There's is absolutely something we can also train. We can learn to do well. And so I'm interested, just it may not be something you've studied directly, but I'd love to know your thoughts on that, whether you see it's kind of a combination of those things or otherwise.
Yes, this is a topic that is very interesting to me, and I have done a few studies on it because my own family, come from a long line of trans channelers, and we have all these, different
Oh yes, I forgot you did.
capabilities
Yes.
in my family. And so I've been very, very curious about the genetic component. In fact, in that telephone telepathy study that I told you about, we did look at genetics, and we found that the results were a bit mixed. So if you were 50% related or 25% related, there was a little bit stronger accuracy, but not if you were 12.5 related. So it was a little bit confusing. But we've done one study looking at the genetics of psychic abilities, where we looked at people who had really strong abilities versus those who didn't. And we found a really fascinating finding difference between them. So we're hoping to do more research when we look at the actual genetics of people to see if there is a difference. We've done numerous surveys asking people about family history. Do you have family members that have this? And for the most part, people do, depending on the type of abilities that shows up for them. The other interesting piece is when you talk to people who teach this, they say that they can also train it. And I've learned that myself, as I have strengthened my meditative practice, that, I can get better at these various abilities. And so in this moment, my feeling is that it's both. That perhaps you are born with a certain propensity to a certain type of ability, and that you can train it. So you just look at, let's say, football players. You know, I can get out on the pitch and kick the ball around, but I'm never going to be a Pele, right?
That
So
wasn't the metaphor I was expecting you to use then.
right? But if I practiced every single day, shooting goals and passing, I'd get better, but I'm never going to be, a professional football player, right? So I think it may be similar that there is a normal variation amongst humans in terms of how skilled they may be. They can train it to improve it, but not everyone's going to be the superstar. And that you may have superstars in telepathy who are just born with some innate talent. But I personally hold the idea that all humans have the capacity to tap into this intuitive, noetic wisdom and use it to support us, whether it's in our daily life with decision making or supporting other people through coaching or healing, etc. So back to this intention piece and how we can use it to be of service to others. I think that the power of the healing relationship is so much more profound if we bring that present moment awareness and our focused attention and intention to support them in their health. And, in the Western world, it's so easy to be cut off here and very in our heads. And it's like, okay, what am I going to do with them? And how can I help them? And yet bringing that kind of grounded, heart-centered intention can really support the process. And then you can engage the person you're working with in the same way and share with them about this evidence and say, hey, your intention matters. If you hold the intention, I am healing right now. I am, empowered. I am whatever they're working on to bring that, clarity of vision and intention to it, I think really does make a difference. I've seen that in my own life and my patients when I was seeing patients, and I absolutely see it now with all the research that we're doing.
I love this so much. I was, as you were talking, I was contemplating that if we're in a type of work that is already acknowledging the existence of things that perhaps are outside the sort of known mainstream, typically scientific view of how things work. If we're already stepped outside of that, again, personally, if I'm working doing a shamanic healing, I'm already outside of that kind of way that we've collectively agreed things work. So it's much easier for me to know that these things have power. However, if we're still in a more mainstream role, again, it could be a therapist, it could be a coach. I think what we're talking about here is really important to recognize, like, it has a place in order to, I guess, be most effective with our clients. It needs to include things like this that, as far as I'm concerned, are as old as humans. As you were talking earlier about that kind of, we're born potentially, some people with a propensity to certain abilities. I was thinking back to in many indigenous cultures, there's someone who fulfills the role of shaman, medicine person, medicine man, and they do have, it seems to me from what I've heard and experienced, they are born with a certain way of being that has them fulfill that role. They're meant for that role. They are, of course, that they're taught and guided into it, but there's an underlying way that they are that allows them to have these gifts. As you say, I believe that all humans have the capability, but there is something specific about them that allows them to step into a role that they can then use to serve others. So it makes complete sense to me. And I think, so if we are the ones in that role, whether or not we're the shaman or the coach or anything else, knowing the kind of the full capacity of gifts and ways of connecting and ways of healing available to us feels so important for us to know. It feels
Absolutely.
incredibly important.
Absolutely. We have a huge project called the Noetic Signature that we're working on right now that is based exactly on what you're talking about in this moment. And so, with this idea that we all have this innate ability to access the inner wisdom, but the way it shows up for each person is very unique. Their expression of it varies considerably. And so we call this the noetic signature. And so we've gone through this, a number of research studies to develop the noetic signature inventory, or the NSI, which is a 44 item scale that allows you to discover where you lie on these 12 characteristics of how people's noetic signature is expressed. So we discovered these 12 different ways of being, if you will, with this intuitive wisdom. And you can take this inventory, see where your strengths lie, and then, perhaps work on strengthening the ones that aren't strengthened or see how it changes over time. It really is this sort of learning tool to discover your specific way of expressing this noetic wisdom. And so, just to give you an example, one of them is called embodied sensations. So I get goosebumps if I hear like a strong truth that to me is, inspiring me to follow it. I get goosebumps all over my body. And
Do you know
so,
that that's the one thing? I think you shared this with me on our last call, and if I remember rightly, I think it was you that also shared the Dutch name for this is truth bumps. Was it you that
no,
told me
I've
this?
never heard
Oh,
that before. That's
it
fair.
must be two separate conversations I've had, but it was certainly you that told me that like that's a kind of like embodied way of channeling because
Yes.
I get exactly the same, and it's when I hear truth. I just like, goosebumps all over. And I never understood why. And then when you said that, I was like, oh, it now
Yes.
makes so much sense. And it must have been a
Yes.
separate conversation that someone said, oh, they're called truth bumps in, I think it was Dutch. And I was like, oh, it makes even more sense.
Yes, yes. And so what's fascinating is you and I would score high on that on the inventory, but someone
Mm.
else might not. Other people don't get goosebumps. And you're like, oh, really? It's like, no, I don't get goosebumps. I get this other thing. And so it
Mm.
really is this tool to help us kind of notice and be aware of the way that we get this truth, this higher truth, this broader
Mm.
truth beyond our five senses. And so, one of the 12 was telepathy, one was precognition, one was being able to hold objects and actually get information from them. Anyway, I won't go through all 12 of them, but people can go to our website and take that if they're interested in learning more about that, the Noetic signature inventory. But I think and it's also not meant to say, oh, one way is better than the other. It
Mm.
really is this tool for exploration, for finding, well, what's my way of expressing
Mm.
this intuitive wisdom? We're finishing a project right now where we found that actually dreams, whether you get this information in your dreams or not, was a really interesting distinguisher between noetic types, which I think is really cool. I'm not a dreamer,
Mm.
but many people get information from their dreams.
Mm. Well, I've had something the other way. I often get information in my dreams, but I've had recently a couple of examples where it's as if I what I've thought about someone has then appeared in their dreams that night, and then the following morning they've messaged me. They don't know that I was thinking about them and I hadn't intended to sort of interject into their dream, but they've then messaged me the next morning to say, I had this crazy dream last night. And even the fact they've sought to tell me, they didn't, one dream, what I was in the dream, the other dream, I wasn't in the dream. And yet, interestingly, they still thought, oh, I'll reach out to Lian. And shared the dream with me, and it was so specific to the thing I'd been thinking about them, and quite random. Like it was nothing, no reason I would have been thinking the thing about them, and yet it was very specifically in their dream. So I don't know if you've come across that so far in your studies, but that's been. I think it's probably happened in the past, but it's happened like twice, very clearly, just recently. So I'm like, there's something going on there too that I'm realizing.
Yeah, so that person or people who came to you would have scored high on the dream characteristic. So not
Mm.
everybody gets it in dreams. And I'm working on the discussion of this paper now, trying to think about, well, why is that so? And so perhaps the people who have it in their dreams have better dream recall, or perhaps
Mm.
they pay more attention to their dreams, or perhaps the dream state is an altered state of consciousness that really relaxes the ego, relaxes the personality in a way that might allow this noetic information to come through. So maybe that same person that came to you with the dream, you know, I don't want to make it, it's not a negative judgment about them, but maybe they're just really busy or really, you know, they don't allow that intuition to come through during the day. But when they're asleep,
Mm.
it comes through. Whereas someone who is more open to it may have received you thinking about them in a different way in their
In
waking
the
life.
moment, perhaps.
Yes.
Yes. Mm,
I don't
that's
know. I'm just kind of,
fascinating.
you know,
Mm.
making things up here, but we don't really quite understand it at the moment. But it's quite fascinating. I'm excited to look more into that.
Mm. Yes, that's so fascinating. There's I feel like we're really almost just at the tip of the iceberg of the possibilities of how this can unfold. Again, with the, I love the way that you're bringing the lens of your studies, like very specifically now into like how can this be used? How can this be used to serve, you know, healing and well-being? And I, I from what I've already experienced in my life, I think that we are just reclaiming wisdom that humans have always known, and we're now kind of like, I guess, in that work of reclaiming it and also understanding it in the ways that you're studying. And I find that so exciting. It's just like that for me, it's like that's where it's at. It's like really cool to know these things exist, but like if we can actually use them, isn't that just you know, the right use of science as far as I'm concerned?
Absolutely. And it's so needed. I mean, you look
Mm,
around our world today and it's just people can get into a very deep state of powerlessness and
mm,
depression about, you know, the intense war and violence and environmental collapse, etc. And yet at the same time, there's also increased hope and empowerment and awareness of this
mm,
interconnectedness and that our intention does matter. Another fascinating piece related to that is, you know, I mentioned these random number generators. So there's a project called the Global Consciousness Project that has been going on for decades, and they have these random number generators all around the world. And at moments of great import, you know, New Year's Eve, global meditation, they can actually look at this data and see how these collective energies influence these random number generators. So we're Heart Math is leading the project, and we're a partner with that on Global Consciousness Project 2.0. And it's this new and improved, revised network of these devices. So we can see when groups of people come together and hold the same positive healing intention or different things are happening in the world, how that can actually influence the physical world. So to me, this is a huge message
mm,
of hope, even as we see things crumbling around
mm.
us, to not give up, to, you know, keep staying focused on our inner work, on supporting others to be of service and to bring that positive healing intention to envision and manifest the world that we want to see around us with peace and love and freedom for all.
Mm. Oh my goodness, what a beautiful way to bring this incredibly fascinating conversation to a close. Um, I'd love to know, where can people find out more about you and the work you're doing and how they can take that inventory too?
If you go to our website, it's Noetic, Noetic.org. We have a wealth of information, including taking the Noetic signature inventory. We have free online webinars. All of our publications are there. You can participate in our research studies. We'd love to have you join our community.
Oh, Fabulous. Thank you so much. This has been another absolute delight, just like the last time. I just absolutely love what you're doing. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Lian.